Everyone, welcome to week 14, day 2 of Golf Evening and Weekend Platoon. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about CRUD. Yesterday, you guys talked a little bit about the read and update functionalities. Today, we're going to be doing the create and delete functions. So, just to recap where we were yesterday, um, we started out by creating, we've done this for both the Pokemon app and the Move app. Um, but we started out with a get request to get all of the Pokemon within our database. And again, the way that we design every single requester in our views is we first have to access all of the Pokemon objects or the objects that we're building somehow. In this case, for the get request, we just need to take all the Pokemon objects. If we are trying to update or make a put request, we need to get a specific Pokemon by its ID. Once we retrieve our Pokemon objects, we then need to make whatever changes we need to make to them. So in this case, you can update the level or the captured status. But if we're just retrieving Pokemon, we don't have to make any changes. Once we've gotten and fiddled with our Pokemon a little bit, now we have something that can be returned and updated in our database. So firstly, we need to serialize our Pokemon, as it says here, using the serializer, which is also done down here. Once our Pokemon has been serialized, we want to turn it into JSON format. And then lastly, we can return it. For GET requests, we never actually have to update anything in the database, which is why we don't see anything about cleaning the data or saving the data in our Get All Pokemon view. And the same thing for getting a specific Pokemon, we're just returning a single Pokemon. We don't need to uh, do any saving or full cleaning or anything like that. The only time that we really do need to do saving and cleaning is when we make changes to our database. One example of that is going to be in our put request. So again, with our put request, we are not adding anything or removing anything from the database, but we are still making a change to something in it. So whenever we change something in the database, we're changing something about that Pokemon, we first need to make sure that all of our form fields are validated, which we can do by cleaning the data. And then we have to save the Pokemon to our database. And then lastly, it's always good practice to return a response after you have done something to your database. Sometimes people will just return a response of the changes that have been made or of the object that has been changed. Other times people will just return a response of like a text string that says your Pokemon has been updated or something like that. But you always want to return a response basically whenever you make a request. So again, we have four main functionalities. We have create, which we're going to get to today. We have read, where read is the same thing as your get request. You have update, where update is represented by our put request. And we have delete, which will be represented by a delete request. So let's get started with the post request. So post and put are somewhat similar in syntax. Again, everything follows the same general. Actually, I'll just write it out somewhere. That might be a good idea. So we have format or API views. And again, this is just a general guide that I like to follow. We have get the relevant objects, e.g. Pokemon. Then make changes to relevant objects. So like for the put request, that would be updating the level or updating its capture status. Once you make those changes, so if changes are made, say clean and save data, and then serialize and turn into JSON, return response. So this roughly five-step process is what we're going to continue to follow. And again, you can see that we've done that in the get request for all Pokemon and getting it for individual Pokemon and for our put. So let's first, again, get started with that post request. So we cannot define uh, we cannot define a create function in Django because it will not know what we're doing, but we can generate a post function, which again maps over to the type of request that we're making. So let's define our post, and because we're going to do this in all Pokemon, as again, we can't create a post request for Pokemon if we've already selected a Pokemon. That doesn't make any sense. And yes, let me paste that in the chat. Yep. I'm also going to pop this in the Slack once we wrap up. So we need to start by making our post requests, which again is going to, this is the same thing as create slash lowercase create slash adds a Pokemon to our database. So what this means is just like all of the other post requests that we've made before with APIs, whatever is in the request body is then going to get created as a Pokemon object. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is, I'm just going to put pass in here so that way it doesn't keep on getting upset at me. So the first thing that we'll want to do is turn the body of the request into a new Pokemon object. Because the body of the request is going to contain things like the Pokemon's name, its level, whether it was captured, etc. Basically, all the things that go into a brand new Pokemon. So this part here is essentially the same thing as the first two fields. We can't get the Pokemon because it doesn't exist yet. So we have to create a new Pokemon and fill it with the data that we're given. So once we have created a brand new Pokemon, then we need to save our Pokemon to the database. We also need to make sure our Pokemon passes validation tests via cleaning. And then we need to serialize our Pokemon, JSONify our Pokemon, and then return new Pokemon as response. So this is also another thing to mention, but saving the Pokemon to our database is a distinctly different step from creating the response that goes back to the user. It's you can intermingle some of these steps, but for purposes of error tracking, it's a lot easier to keep them separated. That way, if you get an error that says something like level or the description field of your Pokemon contains an exclamation mark and it's not supposed to contain an exclamation mark. We know that that error is going to be in saving the Pokemon to our database because that's a validation error. However, if we get a weird type of response that shows up, we know that there's something wrong when we serialized or turned our Pokemon into JSON. Am I lagging out for anyone else?
I was just going to say, I mean, you've been garbled sometimes, but it hasn't been a lot for me. I can still understand what you say when it does garble a little bit in terms of lagging.
Okay, so we now have this series of steps that we need to follow for creating our post request. So let's get started. The first thing that we want to do is create our new Pokemon. So we need to create a variable for a new Pokemon. So we're just going to be slightly basic and call it new Pokemon because that's what it is. Now, what is the command I need to write to create a new Pokemon object?
I've instantiate that table, whatever it is, and pass whatever arguments need to be passed for it.
Mhm.
So Pokemon dot objects, right? Is that what it was?
Yep. That's the first part. And then we can now also look through all the different functions, but this is going to take a while. The one that we want to use is create. So Pokemon.objects.create is going to add a brand new Pokemon object.
And that's because this is a
And
post request, right? Because we want to
yes.
create some, okay.
Yep, so because it's a post request, we want to create a brand new Pokemon object. And we're going to add in some quargs, which will come from our request, but not just the request overall. It's going to come from the data in the request.
Can you
Because
summarize quargs again? Because I mean, for me too, I don't remember exactly what that is.
Sure. So quargs are basically a series of arguments that we are not specifying what they are. I'll send some supplemental links about, actually, let me write down a note to myself right now. Why? Okay, there we go. Quarks. Okay, so they're basically a series of unspecified arguments to a function that you can pass in. So, for example, we by saying request.data in this way, we're basically saying whatever is in the data field of the request, whether that's the level, the name, the description, and all of that, just send all of that over into a brand new Pokemon object. So that way, if you only specify one thing or you specify five of them, they all of those parameters get passed into creating a new object.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so whenever we're doing a post request, we always want to use the object.create function. All right, so now that we've created our object, the next thing we should probably do is save it to our database. So we can do new Pokemon.save. But before we keep going, we should also probably clean the data to make sure that nothing seems off. So we'll do new Pokemon dot full clean. And we'll just make sure, I just want to double check that we use full clean down here as well. Yep, we did do, I flipped the order. Let me move that down here. There we go. I thought something looked off. Okay, so yeah, pass through the validation tests. If it passes the test, then we should save it. It's a little bit presumptive to save it to the database right away, especially if you're saving an object that is not properly formatted. So, but now we're done with everything with our database. So we create a brand new Pokemon object using whatever our request parameters are. We're going to check whether it passes the validations or not, and then we can save it to the database. So that's the first half done. But now the other part we need to do is serialize our Pokemon, turn that serialized into JSON, and then return the JSON as a response. So I'm a big fan of writing each of these steps out separately. You can combine them all into one or two lines, but for ease of comprehension and ease of debugging, it becomes easier, in my opinion, to serialize separately from the JSON load. Also, you can write custom serializers in Django, which can sometimes be a time-intensive and glitchy process. So that's why I'm a big fan of separating them out. So we'll say new Pokemon serialize is going to be serialize in JSON format. They're specifying that. And the query set is going to be our new Pokemon. So also the other important thing, whenever you are using the serialize function, you always need to make sure that whatever thing you're serializing is some form of a list. Because as it says here, you need to be serializing a query set. So in the same way that when we were doing like Pokemon.objects.all, in order to like retrieve all of them, it returned a query set, which was a list of nested objects. Whenever we serialize, we also want to serialize a similar list of objects, or just a query set in general. So I usually just like to put them inside of a list. So we've got our serialized Pokemon. So now we can turn that into JSON. We can say new Pokemon JSON. And then we're just going to do a JSON dot loads. And we're going to take our serialized string and turn that into JSON. And then the last thing we need to do is return our response. And as our response, we're just going to return JSON. Let me make sure that's saved. It looks like it did. Okay, so to walk back through it, and oh yeah, we don't need the pass anymore. So the first thing we need to do is take whatever is in our request body, which is again something that we can set up using Postman, which is how we'll test this. We'll check to make sure our Pokemon passes all of its validation tests. We can save it to the database after that, because if it doesn't pass the tests, then there's no point in saving it. We can just bounce it back to the user. So next, we want to serialize our Pokemon. After we serialize it, we turn it to JSON. After we turn it to JSON, we return the response. Any questions about the post method?
So it's taking in some arguments via the URL that you're passing in, right?
Yes,
And then it's basically creating, instantiating an object and saving it within the database, right? So if that's the reason for the post, are we just returning a response just to let them know, like, yeah, it was done and this is what it looks like?
exactly.
So giving the user something to see.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
So, I mean, we could also return a response of like a simple string that just says, your new Pokemon has been created, or something to that effect.
Okay.
But in general, it's better to give, especially if a user is creating a new object, it's not a bad idea to just return the object to them, because that way think about it from a user perspective. If I'm creating something that has like 15 different fields and I hit enter, but I accidentally made a typo in one of the fields, the only way I'm going to know if I made a typo is if I can see that field back in front of me, aka when it gets resubmitted, or when I get my response back, ideally with the whole object. So it helps from sort of a QA perspective as well.
That makes sense.
All right, so let's go. Any other questions about the post request before we get to testing it? Okay, awesome. So if not, let's go into Postman and make ourselves a post request. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm just going to do a simple little get request just to see all of the Pokemon that are inside of my app right now. So I'll run that get request. We see here that I've got a Charizard that has one move associated with it, and that's it. So let's change this get to a post, firstly. We don't need to play with anything in our headers. We don't have anything authorization. We don't have any parameters. But what we do have is some data. And the data will go inside of our post request body, which is then the thing that's going to get sent into our API. So again, we need to write, you have the option to write this as JavaScript or HTML, but usually whenever we post data, we're going to write it out in a JSON format, which is what we're going to do today. And as we can see here, we have a series of fields that need to be filled. So I'm just going to copy paste these, and we can change a bunch of them. So, yep, not what I wanted to do. Well, we can take that out. And we can take out the column. So let's see. Let's say that I want to add in a Bulbasaur of level 100. It is not captured, and very big Bulbasaur. Nope, did not want to do that. So we have these 4 fields here in our post request that ideally ought to get saved to our database. Now, before I hit the send button on this, let's talk through what should happen when I do hit that send button. So it'll go to my post request where it'll say, all right, I have a request.data, which is the body of that request. There I've filled out 4 different fields. And if we go into our Pokemon model, we should then have the Pokemon's name should get filled in, the level should get filled in, whether it was captured or not, which it wasn't, should get filled in, and the description should get filled in based on whatever we put. It'll then save that Pokemon object to this new Pokemon variable, but it won't save it to the database until we validate the fields and actually save it to the database. After it saves it to the database, it should then also return to us the Pokemon object and say that, it was returned successfully. Otherwise, I'm expecting to get an error. So let's go back to Postman. So make sure that we're posting to this endpoint. We've got everything formatted correctly. Let's hit send. And the first thing that we want to do is double check if we have any error messages. As we see here, we got a 200, which means that the request was successful. And if we take a look down here, it returns the model of our Bulbasaur as we requested. Now, we should probably double check that this was actually correctly created. So to do that, I'm just going to run a get request with nothing in the body, which will again get all of the Pokemon. And as we see here, we have our original Charizard, and I also have my brand new Bulbasaur. So that is how you can write a create method using post and then actually post data to your API to create a brand new instance. Questions on that before we move to delete? Okay. So if not, then let's move to writing delete methods. So we have two different types of delete methods we can write. One of them, which will wipe the whole database, which would go in our all Pokemon section, which we do not want to do, or a delete method that will delete a Pokemon that we select. Sort of like that get Pokemon and update Pokemon methods that we wrote. We can then add in a delete method into our selected Pokemon. So I'm going to go ahead and pull over this format for API views, just so that we can follow it as we're going. So we'll write this delete method all the way at the bottom. So we can just define a delete function that is going to take in some parameters. So we'll put a pass in there. And just so again, Django doesn't yell at me. And we're going to put in what we want our function to do. So we need to keep the format the same as everything else in the selected Pokemon section. So we're going to take in self. We're going to take in our request. And we need to take in an ID, which represents the Pokemon that we're accessing, aka the Pokemon we want to delete. Oh, I forgot to quit my server. Let me stop running that real quick. Okay, so let's go ahead and follow these steps one more time. So the first thing we need to do is access the Pokemon. So we can access it either by ID or name, but I'm just going to copy over the code that we wrote before about how to access a Pokemon, which is again self.getPokemon, where the get Pokemon function is what we defined up here. The first thing we need to do is get the Pokemon. Now we need to make some changes. So the first thing that before we make changes, we need a way to confirm for the user that our Pokemon was deleted. Now, what we could do in our response is just say, the selected Pokemon was deleted. But as the user, you don't know what the selected Pokemon necessarily was. Confirmation messages should always have useful information in them. So in this case, what we'd like to do is we don't need to change anything to our objects, but let's go ahead and just save the Pokemon's name. So we can say Pokemon name is going to be Pokemon.name. This will save the name of the Pokemon, so we can tell our user which Pokemon they deleted. So, because also, if they delete the wrong Pokemon, it's probably a good thing for them to know that. All right, So we've retrieved the name. So now we can go ahead and make the changes to the relevant objects. Or if we wanted to do this in normal person language, delete the Pokemon instance. So we can do that by simply writing Pokemon dot delete. And this will delete the Pokemon object that we accessed. Now, we don't need to clean the data because all the data in our database has already been cleaned. And we don't need to save it because when we do Pokemon.delete, we we don't need to, we haven't made any additions or changes in the database. We just remove something from it. So there's no object for us to save. So we also don't need to serialize the Pokemon because the Pokemon's been deleted. There's nothing to serialize. So we might as well return our response. And we can return our response of, let's see, the Pokemon. And actually, I'm going to use an F string. It's a little bit cleaner. So we can say Pokemon name was successfully deleted from our database. So to backtrack, when we access a delete request, we're going to get the individual Pokemon that corresponds to our ID. Or alternatively, you can also get the Pokemon by its name. It'll then save the name, so that way we can return it in our response. It'll then delete that Pokemon instance from the record, and then return a response telling you which Pokemon was deleted. So this follows the same format as our put request and as our get an individual Pokemon request. So let's go ahead and see this one in practice in Postman as well. I'll switch back over. So we're going to change over to delete. And now is the part where we change up the URL that we're accessing. So if I go up to my delete my delete URL that I'm going to be accessing here, I have two options for how I can. Well, first, let me make sure I can get my Pokemon. So firstly, we can access our Pokemon via primary key. Oh, connection refused. Oh, I forgot to restart my server. Okay, let's try that one more time. So I'm going to do a get request to see if I can get my Pokemon by its key, which I can by primary key 3. And because of the way that we wrote get Pokemon, like the function, I can also access it by its name. And both of those work, as we see. So if I want to delete the Pokemon, I simply need to change my get to a delete, and I can delete my Pokemon by name, by putting the name in there, or by its primary key. Either one will work. For complication purposes, we'll delete the Pokemon through the name. So I'll hit that button, click send. I get my 200 request, and okay, it looks like it just returned the Pokemon itself. So let's try deleting it one more time. Okay, interesting. Let me go ahead and make a get request to this. Um,
Try to do it by the ID just to make sure it's working.
Probably.
See if you like misspelled it or there's something weird about the.
It might have been a slash. Which if it is, that will explain a lot. Let's see. There we go. Yep, it was the end slash. So this is also a good reminder to add the slashes at the end of your requests. So if we go back to our URLs.py, You see here we have the path enter string ID with a slash at the end. If we don't include the slash at the end, then it won't do selected Pokemon. It won't recognize that you want to delete an ID. So when I'm just sending out that request with the parameters, it'll just return whatever's at that. It doesn't, the slash is really important to make sure that it will execute whatever is in the views that you've written. So if we go back to Postman, once I added the slash there, we now get our response saying that it was successfully deleted from the database, which again was the custom written response that we made. So when I go back to get my Pokemon, and we'll get all of the Pokemon, we now only have one Pokemon in our database, which is the Charizard. And to triple check, I'm also going to do a GET request on Bulbasaur, which is what the Pokemon that we had before that is now deleted. And I now get a 500 internal server error. That's in HTML, and we can also visualize it. Come on. And okay, it wants, oh, there we go, preview. That's what I was looking for. And as you can see, it says Pokemon matching query does not exist. So we were able to successfully delete the Pokemon that we just created as well. We can go back to our views, and there's one other thing I want to mention, which is the code to delete our Pokemon. Oh, we should also probably take out the pass. The code to delete Pokemon is a lot faster than the code to post our Pokemon. And the reason for that is because whenever we create our Pokemon, we have to add in those extra steps of cleaning and saving our data, and also serializing and turning it into JSON. Otherwise, they both are following the exact same framework that we outlined earlier of those 5 steps of you get the Pokemon, you get the object, you make changes, do whatever manipulations you have to with it, you clean and save the data if any changes were made, you serialize and turn your response into JSON, and then return it. So with that, we've successfully talked about how to create a new Pokemon using, again, the post function. We've covered how to read or get Pokemon using either getting all the Pokemon or getting a selected Pokemon by its ID, or in this case, by its name. We've talked about how to update a selected Pokemon using a put request. And we talked about how to delete a selected Pokemon using the delete method. Those 4 things, create, read, update, and delete, are what makes a CRUD application a CRUD application. Those are like the 4 essential features of any API. So congratulations for making it through that. Do you guys have any questions about any of the CRUD functionality that we've discussed so far?
Yes, can you scroll down a little bit?
Mhm.
Is that dot delete, is that a Django method?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So
Thank you.
it doesn't exactly say it here, but the delete function in Django will delete the instance of whatever thing you're deleting from your database.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and